Welcome to the Flower Lounge, a place for conversations with wildly creative people and a little plant-loving wisdom to help you experience life in full bloom. I'm Katie Hess, flower alchemist and founder of LOTUSWEI, and I believe in a world where we're all living at our personal edge. Welcome to this week's episode of the Flower Lounge. We have a really unique guest this week. He is a fermentation revivalist. He's written books called Wild Fermentation and the Art of Fermentation, along with hundreds of fermentation workshops that he's taught all over the world, helping to catalyze a broad revival of the fermentation arts. A self-taught experimentalist who lives in rural Tennessee, the New York Times calls him one of the unlikely rock stars of the American food scene. Sandor is the recipient of a James Beard Award and other honors, and his website is wildfermentation.com. And he has an amazing Instagram account too, by the way, of all his travels around the world. Thank you so much, Sandor, for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So we usually start with a little exercise where you just close your eyes and go back to a time in your childhood when you played around flowers or plants or trees, and see if you can identify a favorite flower or botanical. And just think about what you were doing at the time and who you were with, what your favorite was, and reflect on the 3 words you would use to describe your favorite's personality. And whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes and just share a little bit about what you were thinking, what your favorite was, and the 3 words.
Well, I was thinking about a willow tree in my father's yard, and I used to climb that tree. So I was thinking of sturdy and tall, but also, I mean, part of what I loved about the tree was like it was a weeping willow, and it was tall and sturdy, but it also had this sort of like lean to the tree, and a lot of the branches were low enough that we could reach them from the ground. It was also sort of like hunched over and accessible.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Okay, because what we find is that how you describe your childhood favorite typically describes how you bring your greatest gifts into this world. So sturdy, tall, and accessible. Does that resonate?
Yeah, sure.
I would say your work is really accessible. You are all over the world traveling to teach folks about fermentation. How long have you been teaching fermentation?
Pretty much exactly 20 years. I'm actually going to an event this weekend, which is a 20th anniversary event. And at the first of that event is the first time I ever taught a fermentation workshop. So summer of 1998.
And can we get into the, just take us way back to the beginner's mind. What exactly is happening with fermentation, and what are some of your favorite fermentation projects?
Well, okay. So fermentation is action of microorganisms. An incredibly broad range of the foods we eat and the beverages that we drink have been transformed by fermentation before we eat them or drink them. So some of the most common ones, ones that, your listeners probably have some sort of a daily relationship with and don't even realize that they're fermented, would be coffee, bread, cheese, cured meats, condiments, as well as sauerkraut and kimchi and kombucha and yogurt. But, just an incredibly broad range of everyday foods are produced by fermentation.
Even chocolate, right?
Even chocolate, yeah. And vanilla. Yeah, I mean, all kinds of everyday foods that I meet people sometimes who, I tell them what I do and they say, oh, I hate fermented foods. Oh, the flavors of fermented foods are too strong for me, and it just makes me laugh because like really you would have an extremely, extremely restricted diet if you didn't eat or drink anything that was fermented. There's not that much left. But one 1960s scholar of fermentation estimated that around the world, 1/3 of all foods that people consume have been, about 1/3 by mass of food, 1/3 of all food that humans consume has been transformed before we consume it by fermentation.
I know we hear a lot these days about microbiome and bacteria in the gut, and I think it's become more trendy to eat sauerkraut and kimchi and that type of thing. But I can see from your travels that you've studied at length in places around the world where fermentation has sort of like been around for thousands of years and really a natural part of the eating and drinking culture. Any travel stories that you can share, or something that really wowed you about fermentation in other places?
Well, I mean, I would just say that fermentation is part of the story everywhere of how people make effective use of the food resources that are available to them. And just to stay with sauerkraut, because sauerkraut is a really wonderful food. Obviously there's lots of new attention to sauerkraut. There's more and more small regional brands of sauerkraut, but there's nothing new about sauerkraut. I mean, when I meet the old timers, like the families that have lived in the part of Tennessee where I live, people who have been here, whose families have been here, let's say for 100 years. And, at some point their, great grandparents were, basically living a subsistence agricultural life. And, anybody in a part of the world like this with a, temperate climate that, we have really hot summers and, short and mild winters, but still a period of, 4 or 5 months where, there's no, food coming out of the garden. Sauerkraut is just part of everybody's story. And so, when I meet, I have a Cherokee friend in North Carolina, and, fermentation's part of his family's story of, how they were able to effectively preserve food to get them through the winter. When I meet the, sort of families that settled the land in Tennessee and farmed here, sauerkraut is part of their story of how they were able to feed themselves through the winter. So sure, sauerkraut is trending right now, but there's nothing particularly new or novel about sauerkraut.
Right.
It's just, it's how people have in temperate climates with limited growing seasons have preserved, some of the harvest to get them through the period where there's no fresh food. And, in many temperate regions of the world, just human settlement would not have been possible had we not had some insights into methods to effectively preserve food. And fermentation has been very important in that regard, although that's certainly not the only benefit of fermentation. And fermentation is no less important in a tropical kind of climate than it is in a temperate climate. But the benefits are different. In a tropical climate, you don't really need to think about long-term preservation. But because it's hot, you're more focused on short-term preservation. There are more plants in tropical areas that are, have some kind of toxic compounds. And there's lots of ways that fermentation breaks down potentially toxic compounds into harmless forms. So, there's different applications of fermentation in different kinds of climates.
I love that. What kind of fermentation is happening in tropical areas?
Well, for one thing, one of the most important foods in tropics around the world is cassava. American consumers sometimes know it better by its Spanish name, yuca. But in certain soils of the world, notably in the Amazon, which is where cassava is thought to originally come from, as well as West Africa, cassava grows, just based on soil chemistry, cassava grows with intensely high levels of cyanide that could literally kill people if they tried to eat unprocessed cassava tubers. And part of the processing is a simple fermentation. Basically, the tubers are peeled, coarsely chopped, put in water. Being in water initiates a fermentation that breaks down the cyanide compounds into harmless forms that are safe to eat. And as a result, cassava is really one of the most important nutritious plants in the world. And about 1 billion people around the globe get a significant portion of their daily calories from cassava. And fermentation is just a critical part of how it's processed to make the food safe rather than toxic.
Wow, that is fascinating. Have you tried it? I bet
Oh,
you
yeah, sure. No, I've had lots of, even before I was interested in fermentation, I had done a little traveling in West Africa and fell in love with some of the ways that they cook cassava there. And just last year I was in Brazil, where there's a lot of cassava. And actually, I tried this. The juice of the cassava plant is sometimes removed because that's what's thought to be toxic. But then there's a method that they use in Brazil to ferment the toxic juice of the cassava, and then they cook it down into this rich umami paste called tucupi. But my host and I started referring to tucupi as Amazon miso.
Whoa, fascinating.
So yeah, I mean, there's different unusual fermentations everywhere in the world. Of course, the common denominator is alcoholic beverages, and everywhere in the world, people turn whatever kinds of carbohydrates are available to them into alcoholic beverages. Whether it's coconut sap and palm sap in tropical areas, or grapes or other kinds of fruits in temperate areas, grains, milk, cacti. Every available carbohydrate source is turned into alcoholic beverages.
You had some incredible photos on Instagram of sake, like a sake producer in Japan.
Yeah.
Rice. Can you talk a little bit about that? That looks so incredible.
Well, sure. I mean, sake is the Japanese rice alcohol, but, all across Asia, there are distinctive styles of rice alcohol. The Korean name is makgeolli. There's lots of different names for it, lots of different specific processes in different lands, in different regions, but they all involve fungus. So, I mean, basically, making alcohol from grains is intrinsically more complex than making alcohol from fruit or from honey. It will more or less occur spontaneously from fruit or honey, but the spontaneous fermentation of grains will typically yield something acidic, sour, rather than something alcoholic. So to make an alcoholic beverage from a grain requires an enzymatic transformation to basically break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars that can be fermented into alcohol. And in our Western tradition of beer brewing, we use malting, which is really just germination or sprouting. And so we literally allow the seed to begin to germinate, which sets in motion enzymatic changes that break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. From the plant's perspective, the idea is that's what's going to nourish the seedling. But if you stop the process before the seedling emerges, then you've just broken down the sugars, and you have all these enzymes with the capacity to break down further carbohydrates into simple sugars. In the Asian traditions, mostly this has been done with molds, fungus, rather than germination. So koji, which is the Japanese name for rice with a fungus grown on it, koji is the starter for making sake. There's lots of other forms of this. I mean, I would say it could be a whole field of ethnobotany because, in every culture they have different plants that they collect, that they make part of that sort of fungal cake that initiates this process. But, this mold, Aspergillus oryzae, has enzymes that break down the complex carbohydrates of the rice or other grains into simple sugars that can be fermented into alcohol. The third way that humans do this, besides germination and growing fungus, which is really more appropriately called the first way, because everybody agrees that it's the most ancient way that people made alcohol from grains, but it basically uses enzymes that our bodies produce. In our saliva. So there are living traditions in South America, parts of Africa, parts of Asia, where people literally chew grains with their teeth and saturate them with their saliva in order to accomplish this same enzymatic transformation to produce alcohol. And, sake is amazing. I mean, in Japan, there's been incredible, refinement of the process of making sake, and it has some of the highest alcohol levels of any fermented beverages and very particular temperature requirements. But, every process that has been refined and made more complicated has its roots in greater simplicity. And really the most exciting thing that I learned in Japan from a sake maker, it was an incredibly simple old method to make sake. And, I wrote it about it on my website, which is wildfermentation.com. I documented the process, tried to describe it in simple terms to enable other people to do it. And I've been having excellent results making sake that I drink and share with my students and friends.
Yum. Oh my goodness. So how often are you making fermented products? Or, how often are you fermenting?
Well, fermentation is definitely an ongoing part of my life. It's not that I'm fermenting new things every day, but I have certain ongoing things. I have a sourdough starter that I've been working with for 20 years, and I don't necessarily work with it every day. But when I unless I'm traveling, I'm working with it every week. Right now, it's resting in the refrigerator. But then, when I'm ready to make some bread or make some pancakes, I'll take it out and warm it up and feed it and get it vigorous and start using it. I've been using the same yogurt culture for many years, and about once a month, maybe once every 6 weeks, I'll turn a gallon of milk into yogurt, and then one of the jars I'll entomb in masking tape, and I'll write "starter, do not eat." So I always maintain my starter, and then when I'm running low again, I get some more milk and I turn it into yogurt. Things like sauerkraut or kimchi. I mean, I actually made a batch of like a radish kimchi a couple of weeks ago.
Yum.
In general, when the weather's getting really hot, if I make that stuff, I make really small batches. In a place like, I live in Tennessee, the summers get intensely hot, average daily temperatures well into the 90s. And so this isn't a great time for long-term preservation. First of all, the season's just beginning where we're going to have tomatoes and zucchinis and all kinds of fresh foods out of the garden coming out of our ears. And so we don't really need to preserve food from previous season. And when the temperatures are intensely hot is really when it's hardest to preserve food. So, what I'll make big batches of is, the fall crops in about November. And then I'll ferment them all through the winter and eat them all through the winter and try to make sure I'm done eating them by about this time of next year, June, when it starts to get really hot again. So, all these activities are seasonal. I make miso, I make sake, I make mead.
You make your own miso?
I make my own miso. I make tempeh. I make lots of different things. Yeah.
Wow.
And really all of these things are simple. For making miso, the hard part about making miso is making koji, which is the same starter as we use for sake, we use for making miso or soy sauce. And so it's growing a fungus on some rice or barley that I'll mix with the beans. So, growing the fungus is a little bit fussy. I basically turned a defunct commercial refrigerator into an incubator. I use an incandescent light bulb with a little temperature controller to keep the temperature in there about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's the hard part. And then once I make my koji, all it takes to make miso is I soak some beans, I cook some beans, I cook them till they're soft, I mash them up with a potato masher, I add some salt, I add the koji. If I'm going to age it for a while, I'll add mature miso to introduce a larger community of organisms. And then you just wait. So, I mean, making it isn't a big deal. I mean, the hard part is, waiting for 6 months or a year or 2 years.
My God. So long. You wait so long.
Yeah. Sure. No, I just opened the oldest ones. So I usually, at this point, I'm on a like 3 to 4 year delay. So
oh my God.
I give them years. Yeah.
Wow.
I have an unheated cellar. Like if you live in a heated apartment, you would never want to age it more than through a summer. Like if you try to age it through winter in a heated space, you'll end up with a brick because it'll dehydrate. So, you can age miso for years and years, but it has to be in a space that isn't being heated.
Whoa. Wow. I find that so fascinating. Okay. So, I mean, it's just like, to me, it's just like food is so delicious. I get excited and hungry listening to you talk. And let's dive into some of the health benefits.
Okay.
What can you tell? What can you share with the listeners about, I mean, because we see this, right, in cultures with longevity and really long lives, they're eating lots of fermented foods, right?
Yeah, sure. But I mean, everything is multivariable. I mean, let's say, foods like yogurt, miso have been associated with longevity, but, no food is in isolation. Like, if you're eating fast food all day and then having a small bowl of yogurt, like it's not like it's going to undo all the, So it's hard to generalize about the health benefits of fermented foods because, like, okay, I gave you this long list at the beginning of everyday foods that are products of fermentation. It's not as if, bread, chocolate, salami, sauerkraut, and cheese all have precisely the same nutritional qualities because each one is a different kind of a food. But the pattern, the process of fermentation transforms foods in some very clear patterns. And I would say that there are 4 broad ways in which foods are transformed by fermentation. Number 1, I would call predigestion. And this is the simple idea that while the food is fermenting, nutrients are being broken down into simpler and generally more accessible forms. I think, perhaps the food that illustrates this most vividly would be soybeans. The reason why the vegetarian subcultures of the West adopted soybeans as an almost singular replacement for meat and milk is that soybeans are considered to be the plant food with the most concentrated protein. The problem with this is that our human digestive systems are not capable of extracting the protein from a soybean. So you never really hear about people just cooking soybeans until they're soft and sitting down with a bowl of soybeans for dinner the way they might with, chickpeas or pinto beans or lentils. Right. And the reason is that, if you do that, it'll give you, terrible indigestion and gas, and you're not going to get the protein out of the soybeans because our digestive systems just aren't capable of that. Mm-hmm. So this was recognized by the Asian cultures that pioneered soy agriculture, and they developed all of these different ways of fermenting the soybeans. So, miso that we've already talked about, tempeh, which is completely different, soy sauce, also very different, natto, another completely different variant, and there are many others. But these 4 that I mentioned, they involve different processes, different organisms, different lengths of fermentation. They come from different regions of the world. But what they have in common is that the protein gets broken down into amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. This is predigestion.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Can you tell me exactly what natto is? I've seen it in Japan and it's so funky and stinky and I don't quite understand.
So natto is just another style of fermented soybeans. It's fermented with a bacteria called Bacillus subtilis. It's an example of an alkaline ferment. So you hear a lot about acidic ferments, you hear a lot about alcohol ferments, but yeah, there's a range of fermentation byproducts, and some of them are alkaline. The alkaline ferments tend to have sort of an ammonia edge. They smell a little bit like ammonia, like certain cheeses when they get very ripe begin to have that ammonia edge and have alkaline fermentation byproducts.
And I know you were on a track there with 4 different ways that they can help us. But is there a difference between the acidic versus alkaline ferments in terms of health benefits?
Well, sure. I mean, sure. They're different organisms, but like the counter. So there's this whole acid alkaline analysis of human health, which I assume is what you're referring to. And the general analysis is that the modern diet, heavy in sugars, generally deficient in minerals, tends to produce an overly acidic condition. And there's this sort of encouragement to alkalinize. What alkalinize really means in foods is mineralize. Mm-hmm. And so even the acidic ferments, because it makes the minerals so much more bioavailable, have the net effect when we eat them of alkalinizing us. Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean, the alkaline ferments are great. I mean, Bacillus subtilis and some of the compounds, the byproducts that it produces when it's digesting soybeans are unique and extraordinary. And you can walk into any vitamin supplement store in North America today, and you can buy natto kinase, an extract of natto, which has been found to dissolve fibrin, which is like what builds up in people's blood vessels sometimes and constricts circulation. So there's a very, very specific benefit to natto specifically, but as a culinary acceptability idea, I would say for like most people raised in the West without Japanese families, they're going to find both the alkaline ammonia-like aroma of natto, and perhaps even more so the slimy coating on the beans and the little sort of strings that it creates when the beans separate, a little bit challenging. And I mean, I've had the experience many times of trying to order natto in Japanese restaurants and having the waiter, often the Japanese waiter, discourage me by telling me I'm not going to like it. And then I have to say, well, actually, I've had this food many times. I do like it. I know I'm unusual, but I do like it. And it's okay, and I'll pay for it. So I've certainly had people try to talk me out of ordering natto, but natto has grown on me. I mean, certainly the first time I tried it, I found it very, very off-putting. But then when I kept reading about the benefits of it, and then meeting people who told me that they sincerely liked it, it just caused me to give it another try. And our taste is very, very malleable. I mean, we're completely products of our upbringings, and I just try to always challenge myself. When I see other people enjoying something, I try to always challenge myself to eat it, even if it's something that's not, obviously enticing to me.
I had no idea that natto kinase came from natto. That's like, wow, a big duh for me. That we should all be eating it in the West because we all have such a problem with heart.
I would also add that all across West Africa, there's a group of condiments, not made with soybeans, but made with African locust beans and other mostly tree legumes that involves exactly the same bacteria, Bacillus subtilis. So this isn't something that's really unique to Japan.
Sure.
It's found in a region of Eastern Asia, and it's also found in Western Africa. So, a few broad areas of the world, this is just like a flavor that's commonly found in food.
And they likely have a lot less heart disease than we do.
Yeah.
I'm guessing. Yeah. Okay, so back to the 4.
Okay, so pre-digestion, and so I was using the soybeans as an example of how proteins get broken down. I mean, milk would offer us another example. I mean, so many people can't tolerate lactose, but have a fine time with fermented dairy products where the lactose has already been digested by the fermentation organisms. Even gluten in bread. Yeast does not consume gluten, but bacteria break down gluten. And so traditionally fermented breads using natural leavening by a broader community of organisms that includes bacteria will typically have greatly diminished levels of gluten. So, lots of the nutrients that people have a hard time with can be broken down by fermentation, but lots of different nutrients can be broken down by fermentation. And a really important aspect of predigestion is the idea that minerals become much more bioavailable. Basically, fermentation breaks down mineral bonds that otherwise prevent us from accessing nutrients. So when researchers have analyzed, let's say, rice and lentils just cooked, they find much higher measures of minerals in the fermented versions than they do in the unfermented versions. And this is true really of all grains and legumes. Fermentation unlocks the nutritive potential of them, predigestion. Then the second way that food is transformed by fermentation is it's the flip side of predigestion. I call it detoxification. So it's predigestion, but instead of breaking down nutrient toxic compounds. So whether we're talking about the cyanide in cassava, whether we're talking about the oxalic acid in rhubarb or chard or spinach, lots of different potentially toxic compounds that are part of plants get broken down under fermentation. Then beyond breaking down what's part of your original food, whether it's nutritive or toxic, fermentation generates certain additional nutrients. I think of these as micronutrients. They're essentially metabolic byproducts, of the fermentation processes. So like we're talking about natto and nattokinase. That would be an example of a fermentation byproduct that, has a specific therapeutic value that's not found in the raw food, but it's generated by the process. Another example of this would be that sauerkraut and other styles of fermented vegetables have these compounds which are regarded as anti-carcinogenic. And they too are a metabolic byproduct of the bacteria that's being recognized as a compound that has a specific therapeutic benefit for us. And there are lots of, unique organic acids. This is what sort of some of the excitement about kombucha is about, unique organic acids that are found in it. Lots of different biochemical which are really just being investigated right now. But then what I would consider to be, the most profound benefit of fermentation beyond any of these things that I've mentioned is the bacteria themselves. Not every fermented food has living bacteria. If you want to eat bread, if you want to eat the sourdough dough raw, that's teeming with bacteria. But once it goes into a hot oven and gets baked, the bacteria die. And I'm not saying that bread is bad because of that, just illustrating that certain foods lend themselves better than others to live culture consumption. And so I would say that, bacterially fermented foods that are not cooked or heat processed after their fermentation are the ones where you're going to find the live bacterial cultures. And basically, these bacterial cultures are probiotic. They're not probiotic in the sense that they are specific strains that have been introduced for a specific benefit, but rather they're probiotic in the sense of embodying great microbial biodiversity. And when we eat these foods, basically the microbial diversity of the foods enters our digestive system with the trillion bacteria already present there, and it is the interaction between the bacteria that we ingest and the bacteria that are already in residence in our bodies, that sort of generates these sort of like immune responses that are positive, that can improve our digestive processes. There's some new evidence suggesting that it can improve our mental health. But I mean, for me, the takeaway is every function and every system of our bodies relates to gut bacteria in ways that we really failed to recognize until the last couple of decades. And, foods which can potentially help to improve biodiversity in the gut can help us in all sorts of different ways, some of which we are specifically aware of at this point, like the ways that it can benefit digestion and immune function, and some of which is just beginning to come into focus, like ways that it might impact upon our mental health and brain chemistry.
And have you ever had any personal experience around, like when is enough and when is too much? So is this something where we can eat as many fermented foods as we like, or is it in moderation? Have you ever had an experience where, say, my belly turns into a kombucha factory, where too much becomes too much, or is it really just...
Well, I mean, I guess I want to be a voice for moderation, and just because something is good doesn't mean that more of it is better.
Okay.
I mean, kombucha has sugar in it, and I mean, when I meet people who sort of have, transformed their 2 liter a day soda habit into a 2 liter a day kombucha habit, I'm left thinking like, well, I don't think that they're necessarily doing themselves such a great favor. Sure, kombucha is more wholesome than soda, but you're still having an awful lot of sugar, and that in and of itself can create problems. Sauerkraut is salty, and so I would say the limiting factor is the salt. Like I don't think you could have too much sauerkraut bacteria, but it comes with salt, and it just makes sense to be moderate about salt. So, I mean, I think with all of these things, moderation and eating them regularly is much, much more important than eating large portions.
And eating a wide variety, because it sounds like you're very you're eating lots of different forms of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, really, the conclusion that I have come to is that probiotics is all about biodiversity. I mean, nothing's wrong with eating sauerkraut or yogurt every day, but if you're really looking to, enhance biodiversity, eating some yogurt, eating some sauerkraut, drinking some kefir, having some kimchi, trying a fermented corn relish or something completely different, but different vegetables from different places, fermented at different times, are all going to have, different microbial communities.
What's the drink with vinegar in it?
You're probably thinking of shrubs.
Is that a fermented food?
Well, a shrub has vinegar. Vinegar is fermented. Okay. And so, I mean, there's this whole movement of drinking vinegars, and people making sort of vinegars with something sweet that you maybe mix soda water in with to make a beverage. Sure. I mean, there's a lot that's happening in this world of lightly fermented beverages. And it's really, it's a vast world of possibility. I mean, last week I hosted a workshop, and one of my students who was from Florida was showing us how to make tepache, which is like a Mexican pineapple beverage, lightly fermented beverage. So it's basically just pineapple skin and a little bit of flesh in a sugar water solution, and the flavor of the pineapple infuses into the solution. The bacteria and yeast from the skin of the pineapple begin fermenting the sugar. It begins to ferment, and it's a lightly alcoholic, lightly acidic beverage that she left, and it was delicious. I love this Caribbean lightly fermented beverage called mabi. It's a bitter, sweet decoction of a bark spiced with other things that is then fermented. But really, like, we can flavor. We can flavor these things with anything. There's all of these traditional models, which I love, but, my favorite thing is when people get inventive and they take, these traditional processes and then start playing around and seeing, what kinds of, far out ingredients they can replace them with.
What have you experimented with, or what have you seen? What kind of crazy things have you seen people doing?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you that when I went to Japan, I had people telling me that, like, they never realized you could make miso with anything other than soybeans. And that, because their culture is so, sort of built on tradition. Somebody told me, like, no one in Japan ever thought about fermenting other kinds of beans. But then looking around at the culinary landscape right now, I see people fermenting not only beans, but I see people incorporating into miso chestnuts or sweet potatoes, sometimes replacing the beans altogether with nuts like pistachios or pine nuts or walnuts. And
wow.
There's a guy in Cleveland who's curing meat using koji. So, I mean, people are taking these fermentation traditions and, sometimes applying wild creativity to come up with completely different kinds of products. And to me, that's very exciting.
And for people who can't have dairy, it seems to be a growing trend of doing fermented or aged nut cheeses, right?
Sure. No, I mean, there's wonderful, wonderful nut cheeses. I'd say a lot of the early books about vegan cheeses sort of forgot about the aging part of cheese and were really focused on creating the textures of cheese. But I think that there's definitely a new generation of books and of products that are, really excellent, nut and seed based, aged, funky cheeses. And I've had some really great ones.
Okay, one more question for you. Since I'm such a freak about flowers, have you seen any fermented flower beverages or?
Oh yeah, sure. So, I mean, for the the back to the landers where I live in Tennessee, like like dandelion wine is almost a cliche.
Right.
But like, you can make dandelion wine. I've had wonderful marigold wine that's like
wow.
gorgeous yellow orange color. I've had lots of different flower wines, and I have a neighbor who's always flavoring her kombucha with rose petals.
Aw.
So yeah, I mean, flowers are these wonderful aromatic flavorings that can be sort of, captured very easily to a liquid. One of the most wonderful lightly fermented beverages I ever had was at a place in San Francisco called Bar Tartine, but they had an orange blossom cordial. And at the market, one of their vendors had just a big box of orange blossoms with this just incredible aroma.
Wow.
And they brought them back to the restaurant, covered them with a sugar water solution. The flavor of those orange blossoms infused into the solution and began fermenting. And then that whole week, they just ran specials that were cocktails mixed with this lightly fermented cordial based on the orange blossoms. So yeah, there's lots of ways that you can incorporate flowers into the ferments.
So instead of just putting it into alcohol and making a aromatic tincture or alcohol out of it, they just put it into sugar water and waited for the natural alcohol to, wow.
Yeah. And this is, this is really like before there was any grain alcohol to make tinctures, people used fermented alcohol as a means of preserving plant medicine. And so, yeah, absolutely. You can have the fermentation sort of happen to the flowers.
Wow.
And actually, I haven't tried it yet, but friends of mine were just posting on Facebook that they had a new honeysuckle kombucha. So they were using the nectar of the honeysuckle flowers as a flavoring for kombucha. So yeah, I mean the possibilities are limitless, and really, like, the only limitation is our imagination.
Right. I love that. So if we go out and buy the books, Wild Fermentation and the Art of Fermentation, what kind of recipes can we find? Or if we want to just, start out by making something really basic, like, cheese or sourdough bread or kimchi, do you have recipes in your books?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that, I mean, both of my books are completely written for home practitioners. It's all about, easy techniques for fermenting foods and beverages at home. Wild fermentation has traditional recipe format and is sort of written primarily with accessibility in mind. Art of Fermentation is a much longer book. It's about 4 times as long as Wild Fermentation. I've gotten a certain amount of feedback from people saying that was too much information. I just wanted to know how to make it at home. I didn't need to know the history and anthropology and everything, and microbiology of it.
I'm just hungry.
So Art of Fermentation has more information. If you think all those other related topics are interesting, you'll love it. If you're intimidated by a lot of words, you should definitely stick with Art of Fermentation. You should stick with Wild Fermentation. Art of Fermentation also, I have mostly departed from the recipe format. So you'll find all the information that you need, but not necessarily formatted as a recipe. It's more like I'll give people a range of proportions that I've experimented with or seen people use. I'll give a range of different seasoning possibilities, but without structuring it as a recipe. So the books are different, but they're both about empowering people to feel confident fermenting in home kitchens.
I used to make kombucha, and I started to get really wildly creative, and I started adding herbs, from my collection of medicinal herbs. And then I realized, oh my God, what a silly mistake. I was adding antimicrobial herbs to the kombucha, which then were essentially disturbing the whole thing. So I think that, learning with somebody side by side like you can be very helpful. And what can you tell us about, for any listeners who want to see you in person and learn directly from you, what kind of workshops do you have coming up? Are you teaching?
Well, yeah, I mean, right now I'm in the midst of a bit of travel hiatus, so I'm not doing a lot of traveling this year. I'm about to go teach at the Sequatchie Valley Institute, which is about an hour from where I live in Tennessee, this weekend. I'm actually making a trip to Alaska later in the summer, and I'll be teaching in southeastern Alaska in July. And then that's about it for the rest of the year, but I'm beginning to gear up and make plans for 2019. And on my website, I list all of my workshops. So check out wildfermentation.com if you want to find out about my workshops. And also, I'm not the only one, fermentation is a widespread phenomenon. I'm not the only one who is part of this fermentation revival. And I'm really happy to see that there are, people in lots of different places, teaching fermentation workshops. Like I would say one of the, biggest things that I've learned in the last 20 years of doing this work is what a hunger there is for this information. And thankfully, I'm not the only one who's, sort of out there trying to share this information with people. So by all means, check out my workshops, but check out any workshops. There are lots of people who are sharing this information in powerful and effective ways.
Okay, last question for you, Sandor. Do you have any insights, nuggets of wisdom about anything, fermentation or anything about life that you find yourself commonly sharing with people these days?
Well, I guess what I would just love to, leave you with is, fermentation is this, incredibly important mode of transformation of foods and beverages, but fermentation is also powerful as a metaphor. Foods and beverages and carbohydrates and proteins, are not the only things that ferment. And, if fermentation is really like a metaphor of transformation, and ideas ferment and culture ferments, and there's social ferment and there's political ferment, and fermentation is about bubbles, like when your sauerkraut starts fermenting, when your wine starts fermenting, the way you can recognize it is you see bubbles rising. Well, people get bubbly also. And when people get excited about things, they get bubbly. And that's really what like the social ferment and the political ferment is all about, is people getting bubbly. So I guess I just want to leave you with that idea that we all are starter cultures. And, sort of through our, excitement about ideas, through our engagement with people, through our, enthusiasm and our actions, we can cause, sort of fermentation on these sort of larger cultural scales.
What a great way to end. I love that. Thank you so much, Sandor, for your time. And for the listeners, please check out wildfermentation.com. Thanks so much for being with us, Sandor.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to The Flower Lounge. I'm Katie Hess, and we'll be releasing a new podcast every Wednesday. If you like what you heard, or you know someone who might be touched by our conversation, share it with them. And don't forget to subscribe. To find out what your favorite flowers mean about you, take the quiz at LOTUSWEI.com.